Good afternoon, everybody. We'll be starting our webinar in just a few minutes. Going to give folks a little bit of time here just to log on. Thanks. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar. We'll be starting in just about another minute or so. Just going to give folks a few more seconds to log on to the webinar system. Thanks. Okay, good afternoon and welcome, everybody. My name is Colby Duran. I'm the director of the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative at the University of Arkansas, and we're in the Office of the Vice Chancellor for Economic Development. We are also the research partner in the Native Farm Bill Coalition. Thank you all very much for joining us for today's webinar. As a lot of you know, USDA has announced an upcoming tribal consultation, hopefully the first of at least one more. One of the things that we talked about from the folks of the Native Farm Bill Coalition was doing a prep webinar to talk about some of the key provisions, particularly looking at the ones that needed some additional points and information raised during the implementation phase of it. And so this webinar will hopefully be able to provide some additional information and resources to have that conversation, to also be able to get some additional input and questions from you all about some of the provisions, some of the different things that you all are seeing at your tribes and in your communities that are of particular interest, so that we can ensure that those are raised as well. But before we get going and jumping in, I'm joined today by two of our staff attorneys here at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, who've been helping out with the work of the Native Farm Bill Coalition. And I'd like to have them introduce themselves as well. So I'd like to just have Erin Parker, who is our Director of Research, introduce herself.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Colby, and thanks everyone for being here. My name is Erin Parker. As Colby said, I'm the research director and a staff attorney here at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, and I'll be talking about some of the nutrition title issues today.
Great, thank you, Erin. Next, I'd like to have our policy officer, Blake Jackson, introduce himself. Blake.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Blake Jackson. I am a policy officer and a staff attorney here, and I will be talking today about the hemp provisions in the Farm Bill, as well as the underserved producer provisions under the crop insurance title.
Great, thank you, Blake. So a lot of you are familiar, and just to give a quick update on the work of the Native Farm Bill Coalition. The Native Farm Bill Coalition, which was established in October 2017 and really led by the Shakopee, Mdewakanton, and Sioux community, the Intertribal Agriculture Council, the National Congress of American Indians, and then us at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative as the research partner, has really grown substantially since then and has continued to grow. And just for a quick a membership update, there's 170 tribes currently represented in the Native Farm Bill Coalition. That includes 77 Native nations that have passed resolutions on their own, and tribal governments that have taken the time out of their busy schedules to pass letters of support and resolutions of support. We're now up to 15 intertribal and Native organizations that are part of this effort. And then, of course, we have two allied organizations, Mazone, a Jewish Response to Hunger, who's been a strong advocate for anti-hunger issues, and particularly supporting tribal self-governance within the anti-hunger programs, and our friends at the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. If your tribe or organization hasn't joined yet, we would definitely encourage you to do so. You can do that by visiting the Native Farm Bill Coalition's website, sending an email below to the info email, and that would include just sending a resolution or a letter or whatever the appropriate mechanism for your tribe or your organization to approve joining. There's no cost to be able to join, but you'll be able to ensure that you're on our email list, be able to get additional updates, receive information, one-pagers, and some also get notifications about these upcoming webinars. And as I said earlier, we've been doing some webinars, particularly in the lead up to the passing of the Farm Bill, which happened in December 2018. But we're also, particularly in the implementation phase, going to start doing these more regularly, and particularly on about a bi-weekly basis, to try to ensure that there's some additional conversation going on and that a lot of information is being shared out there as well. Before we jump into it, just want to let folks also know that if you have any questions or comments or other input, please don't hesitate to ask. You can do so by typing them into the questions box on the panel on the right-hand side. If you'd like to ask your question aloud, you can also hit the little hand button and raise your hand, and I can unmute your microphone, and then you can ask the question to the audience as well. So with that, just a quick one slide on the breaking down the 2018 Farm Bill. As everyone's very familiar with, it's a 5-year bill. As I said, it was passed in December. It covers a vast majority of USDA spending authorities. And with being a 5-year bill, this time it was passed at $428 billion over 5 years. When they look at the scoring in Congress, they look at things scored out from a 10-year cycle. That's what the Congressional Budget Office requires to look at the budgetary impacts of the program. So you can see the 10-year impact is $867 billion. I will say that this actually makes the Farm Bill, these two amounts, has the Farm Bill actually come in right at budget, so there was no additional budgetary impact by the Farm Bill as it was passed, which is important to note because that is exactly the framing and mechanism that Congress used when it was developing the programs out, to not add any additional spending to the budget for the program. As you can see, nutrition is still by far and away the largest pot of funding in the entirety of the bill, at about 76%, so almost a little over 3/4 of the Farm Bill is nutrition. A vast majority of that is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. And a very small sliver of that is also included the Food Distribution Program on Indian reservations, or FDIPR. That's included in there as well, too. When the Farm Bill was passed and everything was done and settled, the ink was dry and everything was done with it, there were 63 tribal-specific provisions included in the bill. And so we broke those down, looking at about 5 of the different areas of trying to say, where do these different provisions fit in? And there's provisions that focus on tribal parity, access to funding, training and infrastructure, technical assistance and outreach, and support for tribal producers and traditionally grown foods and crops. Now, adding up all of these together, this equals more than 63, but several of the provisions touch on more than one of these 5 buckets. So you can kind of get a breakdown of majority of what the provisions do, and that's kind of what this shows. So when we're going to be talking about today, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the key provisions, at least that we've identified, but all of that is really leading up to this upcoming USDA tribal consultation. And it's going to be in Washington, D.C. on May 1st and 2nd, that Wednesday and Thursday. It's a full day on that Wednesday, and it is but just a little over a half day on that Thursday. It's going to be held at the National Museum of the American Indian, or NMAI, and up there is the email to be able to register for that. And again, to register, you want to submit your name, the tribe and organization that you'll be representing, their title, and all the additional information in there. And also talk about some of the different issues that you're interested in bringing up and raising forward as well too. We're hopeful that this will be at least the first of at least 2 in-person tribal consultations. Hopefully the second one they'll be announcing shortly. But one thing we would like to note is that a lot of the other agencies or sub-agencies at USDA have been doing their own tribal consultations currently. The Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS, is doing some state-level outreach to at least do listening sessions and meetings with the tribes in their regions and states and their producers as well too. So be on the lookout for those. We're trying to send out information on those as soon as we get those. And the Agriculture Marketing Service, which is responsible for implementing the hemp provision, has held a tribal consultation last week and are doing some continuous outreach and information. So there are a lot of other opportunities as well too as this goes forward in here. So the first provision that we're going to start with is looking at some of the tribal forestry provisions. And a lot of the tribal forestry provisions center around 638 and also improving and trying to help support tribal self-determination and tribal management of federal forests. So the first provision is the first of 2 638 provisions, and this represents the very first time that USDA has actually had 638 self-determination and self-governance authority. So under this provision, USDA and also the Department of Interior can enter into 638 self-determination contracts with tribes that allow for tribal management of adjacent Forest Service land at USDA and also adjacent Bureau of Land Management land, or BLL land at the Department of the Interior. All of this management has to be done under the Tribal Forest Protection Act, which is an existing authority that has been around since 2004. Again, that land must be adjacent to Indian forest lands, and that include land that would be under tribal jurisdiction. And also the secretaries retain some strong authority requiring approvals for components that would come up with federal work with federal environmental laws, and like NEPA and all of that. Basically, particularly some of the different components that many folks that are involved in land management already have to comply with as well. For looking at some of the implementation talking points for this, one of the things that really does exist at USDA already is that there are cooperative management agreement authorities that USDA has entered into with several tribes looking at managing adjacent or nearby forest lands. One of the things that really needs to be brought up and we think is an important point to be able to make is to look at some of what that existing cooperative management agreement authority is, and then also work closely with tribes, with tribal organizations, and also the Office of Self-Governance at the Department of Interior to be able to establish how the 638 authority can work and help bolster some of that existing cooperative management agreements and being able to help develop that out. There should be also some direct Forest Service consultation on determining ways in which the 638 authority can be directly tailored for tribal management of federal land. For the 638 authority, we know that because of how this provision is written, this will probably be the provision that the 638 provision that USDA will implement first. When we talk about nutrition, we can go into the why of that. The USDA is looking to be able to do this now. So I would say that if this is something that is very important to your tribe, that is something that is mentioned, that you mentioned specifically either in person or in writing, for the consultation comments and points to ensure that USDA not only understands that, but also knows who to be able to reach out to talk through what some of these different 638 provisions must look like in trying to develop it out for land management. The next forestry provision we'll talk about is the Good Neighbor Authority. So the Good Neighbor Authority has actually existed since the 2014 Farm Bill, and it's been around for that time. When it was included, tribal governments weren't explicitly included in the act, and it only included states and Puerto Rico and other territories. What this act does is it does allow for those states and now tribes to enter into agreements for water restoration, also management of the National Forest Service lands as well too, and is a really strong way to be able to help and develop some of the different relationships, and also a very strong and true recognition that the forest systems and lands really need to have some type of strong cooperative management, and looking at all of the different types of management pieces together and having all of the stakeholders together, sitting down, working through the land management, because that's how you really help support and have strong, healthy forest systems as well too. And again, the 2018 Farm Bill makes tribal governments explicitly eligible for this. This is probably one of those provisions that will be, this is one of those provisions that was very, very strongly supported by pretty much everybody. It's something that not only USDA wanted, but states also wanted as well too. And it is a good recognition that all land management partners must come together to be able to manage those systems. Going on to the next slide for looking at some of the implementation talking points for Good Neighbor Authority. One of the things the USDA Forest Service must do, because there's been that 5-year lag in Good Neighbor Authority access for tribal government, is to reach out that ensure that tribes can start to enter these programs as soon as possible, and also can look at trying to get into some of the existing Good Neighbor Authority either projects or partnerships and build those out with the ones that are already going forward. Additionally, Forest Service should work really closely with tribes throughout the entirety of the implementation to ensure that the implementation and access for tribes to collaborate under these existing authorities are supported as well too, and that there really isn't any additional barriers to access just because of that 5-year lag of having eligibility for the program. Next, there was a couple conservation provisions that we wanted to highlight as well too. There was about 5 or 6 changes overall in the conservation title. The first one, and we always like to talk about this is one of those really big changes that is just the one-word change. So for all of you policy wonks out there, this might be this. I know this is sometimes our kind of favorite wording change. In the conservation section, the National Resources Conservation Service has had the authority since 2008 to enter into alternative funding arrangements with tribes. However, it was always one of those may authorities, and so the change in this Farm Bill was a shall. So it requires USDA to work with tribes and tribal producers to provide alternative funding arrangements under 2 of the biggest conservation programs, and that's EQIP, or the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, and also the Conservation Stewardship Program, CSP. We know that there are a good number of tribal producers and tribes that use these programs already. However, since 2008, there's only been 3 tribal alternative funding arrangements. And these tribal alternative funding arrangements are important, particularly in areas in the Southwest and other places where tribal conservation practices and tribal agriculture practices exist as they have in time immemorial. And so a lot of times when tribal governments, tribal producers come to NRCS for these alternative funding arrangements or to have access to the conservation programs and funding, that the fact that they're practicing agriculture in their traditional way, or in ways that they have always done it, or in ways that don't look like the other producers that come to NRCS, those should not be barriers to have access to that funding. Additionally, the alternative funding arrangements also act a little bit like self-governance light, and that is when a tribe applies for this and gets granted it, they not only are responsible for managing and implementing the practice, but also the managing of the money and other authorities for the program as well too. So it is a very robust way of having implementation of the conservation programs, but then also looking at a strong way of being able to take over some of the actual nitty-gritty management of them. As far as implementation talking points, one thing that USDA must do is look at those 3 alternative funding arrangements, including the full one that exists at Gila River, and build off those successes and to be able to do so with directly engaging those tribes and also consulting with tribes that are interested in alternative funding arrangements. I think there's a lot of strong ways to be able to build out some of the partnerships in this, and that includes looking at some technical assistance opportunities for tribes that are interested in AFAs based upon these successful examples. Additionally, they also must look at what are some of the best ways to help support tribal access to CSP and EQIP through the new Alternative Funding Arrangement Authority, and also looking at some of the unique and specific traditional conservation practices utilized by tribal producers to ensure that those can be included within these type of arrangements and programs. Next in conservation is the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. This was previously a Conservation Reserve Program, and in the 2018 Farm Bill, this actually makes it a standalone program and also allows the Secretary of Agriculture to enter into cost share agreements with tribes, states, and non-governmental partners to help address some of the conservation practices underneath there. Under the 2018 Farm Bill, a portion of the tribe and state cost share agreement is determined through negotiations with the Secretary, and a portion of non-governmental cost share agreements with USDA is at a maximum of 30%. For the implementation talking point for this, USDA's Farm Service must consult with tribes to establish guidelines, allowing the Secretary to consider particularly economic hardships of individual tribes when setting that CREP cost share rate. And again, looking at, as it's a negotiation authority with tribes and with states, being able to have an important consideration of economic hardships is something that's going to be important because it will help allow to support the negotiations and ensure that there's that tribes aren't barred from being able to be involved in this program because of not having the required higher match as well. Additionally, USDA must also take a look at some of the historical CRP data and then also establish a policy mandating that the tribal portion of future CRP arrangements doesn't exceed that of what the state cost shares were as well too. And that's a way to ensure that the equity in the program is maintained in implementation, not only in law. And so with that, we'll go on to our next slide, and that's the tribal nutrition provisions. And from here, I'll turn it over to our research director, Erin Parker. Erin?
All right, thank you, Colby. So for the nutrition title, we're going to talk about two programs. First, the food distribution program on Indian reservations, FDIPR, or sometimes it's called CMODS. And the second program we're going to talk about is the Gus Schumacher Food Insecurity Nutrition Incentive Program, or FINI. We're going to start with FDIPR. So this Farm Bill made a lot of significant changes to the food distribution program on Indian reservations. This is probably the most positive changes that have been made to FDIPR in any recent Farm Bill, or maybe any Farm Bill at all. Many of these changes address some longstanding issues that both tribal leaders and the National Association of Food Distribution Program on Indian Reservations Board, that's a mouthful, NAFDIPR, the NAFDIPR board have been raising with USDA in consultation for the last several years, and that includes a number of the provisions that you see on the screen. We've lowered the Farm Bill's lowered the tribal match requirement for FDIPR to 20%. It was previously set at 25. Though there's always been a waiver of that match requirement, but the Farm Bill really kind of zeroes in on requiring that is provided to any tribe that requests it. We've also made a change in the way that federal funds are able to be used to reach the match requirement. That was not previously allowed, and the 2018 Farm Bill has changed that. So now tribes are able to use other federal funding sources to be able to meet that match requirement after the 2018 Farm Bill. There's also a 2-year carryover funding provision for FDIPR. That's a change that was made in this past Farm Bill, and that's one of those self-executing provisions, and USDA actually released finally a memorandum on that today to actually sort of memorialize that's been made permanent. So as of December 20th, 2018, the day of the passage of the Farm Bill, FDIPR grants now have a period of performance of 2 federal fiscal years instead of just 1, which is what it was previously. And that's been a change that FDIPR and tribal leadership have asked for quite some time, just to be able to allow FDIPR sites to have a little bit more flexibility in their administrative funding. So instead of having to return those to USDA at the end of 1 year, they'll be able to carry them forward for 2 years. There's also a regionally grown provision added to the traditional foods purchasing provision that's in FDIPR. They've modified that language just a little bit to expand a little bit and hopefully allow more tribally grown and locally grown food products to be able to move into FDIPR for the food package. And the Farm Bill also requires the Secretary of Agriculture to buy traditional foods if they can be purchased cost effectively. Traditional foods has been a huge topic of consultation, or in consultation with USDA from tribal leadership for the past several years. So this Farm Bill we're seeing kind of facilitates hopefully a little bit more of traditional food flowing into the food distribution program food package. And I skipped one change because I wanted to save it for last. The most notable change in the Farm Bill that it made to this particular program is this first 638 tribal self-determination contract demonstration project. This Farm Bill allows for tribes to potentially enter into self-determination contracts to actually have more of a say in the food purchasing and procurement for what actually goes into the food packages. This is not something that has money appropriated for it yet, so you'll note here on the slide we still need a $5 million direct appropriation for this program to actually go into effect, but it is authorized in the Farm Bill. So if there is an appropriation put out for it, then tribes will be able to, some tribes will be able to enter into those demonstration project self-determination contracts and actually figure out or look at what the procurement of food is going to look like and actually have a say in that. So that was a pretty exciting change in this past Farm Bill for FDIPR. I think if I can go to the next slide. Yeah, there we go. So for talking points for this, a lot of these are really going to focus on that 638 provision. So we'll get to those in a second. I want to cover this first one, just about the traditional foods, since that has been such a topic in consultation with tribal leadership on FDIPR for the past several years. Really, USDA needs to continue doing what it's doing and work closely with the food package review group that's part of FDIPR to determine which traditional foods need to be added. There are a few traditional foods in the food package right now. There's bison, wild rice, salmon, blue corn, and they're working on getting catfish into the package at present. That food package review group is made up of people from the FDIPR board and other program managers, as well as USDA folks, and that's the group that kind of looks at which traditional foods are going to be added next to the food package, as well as making other updates to the food package. And so really just for this particular, for the traditional foods talking points, really just encouraging USDA to continue working with that group, working with the FDIPR board to see what other foods can be bought and procured that are traditional foods that can be put in the food package. Beyond that, a lot of these talking points are really going to focus on that 638 provision because that's new. That's something that USDA has never done before. And if that provision is funded, being able to talk to USDA now before there are regs formed around it is a really good way to start that conversation and hopefully make sure that that it's rolled out in a good way, in a way that makes sense on the ground for Indian country. So to that end, just throughout the implementation of that provision, USDA should keep consulting with tribal leadership, not just at this upcoming tribal consultation, but all throughout the implementation process, so that we know that this new authority is going to roll out in a way that's tailored to allowing ITOs to actually better serve their people and we think USDA should also be working with Department of the Interior, just because they have not had a 638 provision applied to any USDA program before, just working with Interior to understand best practices in implementing self-determination contracts and self-governance compacts. Next. So USDA should also look at funding multiple 638 FDIPR pilot projects if possible. As I mentioned before, there's not been funding appropriated for this before, but proceeding under the hope that it will have an appropriation on the ground, we hope that USDA will look at not just having one pilot project, but looking at funding multiple pilot projects across Indian country of various sizes and various various numbers of people served, just because we know that there's no one-size-fits-all model in this or anything else in Indian country. So to really understand the unique challenges and opportunities, to really have USDA understand that, to maximize the effectiveness of this pilot project, they should be looking at funding multiple different pilot sites across Indian country. USDA needs to request funding for this program. Obviously, that's the last point here. Because there has been no appropriation, currently USDA needs to request funding for it in the president's budget. One more point on this, I believe. So USDA has been conducting monthly Farm Bill implementation phone calls. There's a Tribal Leaders Consultation Working Group on FDIPR, and the Tribal Leaders at the last consultation with USDA in February asked for, or in December rather, December 2018, right before the Farm Bill was passed, asked for USDA to do monthly phone calls on all provisions that relate to FDIPR. These aren't consultation phone calls. It's really a chance for tribal leaders to get updates on everything that USDA has been working on with regards to Farm Bill implementation that deals with FDIPR, a chance to share ideas, comments, and concerns with USDA. Those calls happen usually the first Thursday of every month at 1 p.m. Eastern. So the ask here is really just having them continue those monthly Farm Bill implementation phone calls throughout the life of Farm Bill implementation. We know this is going to go on beyond this calendar year, and just having that ability to check in with USDA and share those comments and concerns has already been a positive just for the last couple of phone calls that we've been able to have with USDA and tribal leadership. So keeping that going, I think, is going to be important to having this roll out in an effective way. That is everything that has to do with FDIPR. The second program that I mentioned we were going to talk about briefly is the Schumacher Food Insecurity Nutrition Incentive Program, or FINI is what it's commonly called, was renamed in this Farm Bill to honor Gus Schumacher and the work that he had done throughout his life to support farm programs and food insecure people all across the country. So it's FINI. There's a small change here. Tribal agencies, just like in FDIPR, can now use other federal resources and federal funding sources like IHS funding, for example, in order to meet the matching requirement under FINI. And there's a quick ask here in terms of implementation talking points, really just asking that USDA continue in partnership with the Office of Tribal Relations to keep consultation going with tribes to make sure that any regs that come out around this program, any programmatic changes that are necessary to be able to make sure that matching requirement is carried out is done in full consultation with tribes, and tribes have the ability to weigh in on that implementation. And I think that is everything that we've got for the nutrition title. So I will turn it back over to Colby.
Great, very much, Aaron. I know we've had some questions coming in. Just to answer a couple of them at once, we will be sharing the slides in this webinar out once this webinar is concluded, and we will look to have this webinar hopefully posted, available online on YouTube or other places as well too, so folks can refer back to it or find other ways to be able to send it out. So the next part that, and we're going to hold some of the other questions at the end just to make sure that we get through the material on here, but we are getting some really good questions from folks. And then to go on to the next part of the Farm Bill is looking at the tribal hemp provisions, and for that, I'd like to have our policy officer and staff attorney Blake Jackson. Blake.
Thank you, Colby. So to kind of put things in perspective, the tribal provisions in the Farm Bill, we see a great deal of tribal parity and access to programs and equity to that of states, and we don't see a shortage of that when it comes to the sections dealing with hemp production. Previously, hemp was included within the statutory definition of marijuana under the Controlled Substances Act, and that definition was partially altered in the 2014 Farm Bill, where you could have a hemp pilot research program with a state Department of Agriculture or a higher institution of education if it was done in accordance with state law. But notably in that there was no tribal language. Well, we see a big a difference in that in the 2018 Farm Bill, where tribes are on equal footing as states in terms of getting legalized industrial hemp farming and tribes and states can implement new plans to self-regulate, develop, and expand hemp production within their respective jurisdictions. So that's one big thing that we see as a greater degree of tribal autonomy to that of what states can exercise under this brand new program that promises to be a pretty big development. Within the Farm Bill, we also see that the USDA may provide technical assistance to tribes in terms of implementing their framework for regulating hemp on the reservation, and also in terms of plan development. And it also requires, in the later section 10.114, is an interstate commerce provision that requires states to permit a tribe to transport hemp across the state lines, provided that if the hemp was lawfully produced under the Farm Bill provisions at its point of origin. So we see kind of a respect for if you have it legalized in one jurisdiction, a neighboring jurisdiction can't crack down on you if it was legally produced in accordance with the Farm Bill. So that's some of the background issues that that kind of came up with that, and kind of where we're at today in terms of the landscape. So I think that's it. For the implementation talking points, one thing that's of note here is that the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service is the agency that is leading the charge on this and is in charge of approving tribal and state hemp plans. The agency recently took note and said that regulations are not going to be developed until the fall of 2019 to accommodate the 2020 growing season, which is in the spring, is when planting would start. And until then, there will be no approval of tribal or state plans. If you send one in, they're going to hold on to it until they have regulations on the books. So until we get these regulations, tribes and states looking to engage must continue to rely on their pilot program authority in the 2014 Farm Bill, and that is also the USDA's position. But as I previously mentioned, there is no language in the 2014 Farm Bill allowing tribes to participate to the degree that states can in terms of a higher institution of education or a state Department of Agriculture if it's done under state law. And this effectively kind of puts tribes at a systematic market disadvantages when compared to the states, because that lack of language effectively means that tribes are kind of locked out of the market and can't come to the table. And the NIFA, which is the agency that was over the research program, has the position that tribes can if it's in accordance with state law. So there needs to be kind of some attention drawn to that. And in terms of AMS must clarify ways in which tribes and tribal colleges can participate under this 2014 Farm Bill authority, because in doing so, there has to be a clear pathway to ensure that tribes have just as much market access as states currently do under the 2014 Farm Bill until we get some 2018 regulations on the books and finalized. I think additionally, we have some points that the USDA must solicit tribal input throughout the implementation process. Because as we previously mentioned, that technical assistance is available in terms of developing that tribal framework, and so throughout the implementation process, it's vital to have input from tribes into how this technical assistance can be effectively tailored to meet those needs, because tribal needs are often unique in the space of regulatory jurisdiction and in terms of the needs, and it varies across Indian country. So we need to have those voices in the room and the receptiveness on the agency's part to that. And similar to Aaron's discussion in the nutrition title, there was an authorization for appropriation, which means that the Farm Bill says this program is authorized so long as there is funding for it. But unlike the nutrition title with the 638 provisions, there was not a solid dollar amount assigned to it. The Farm Bill just says that the program is authorized to have appropriations as necessary to implement in the industrial hemp program. But it's important to note that there was no direct funding provided through the Farm Bill. So in terms of making sure that Congress knows that the USDA is in support of this, USDA must request full funding for this program through the president's budget to let this know that this is an administrative priority going forward. And so, as we all know, there are different jurisdictional complexities throughout Indian country. And so it's vital that throughout the consultation be robust throughout the implementation process, and throughout the entire implementation process of getting regulations on the books to make sure that the Farm Bill hemp program is implemented to the degree that it respects all the jurisdictional issues and the sovereigns at play. There needs to be tribal input to address these complexities. And actually, there was a listening session on April 11th in which this issue was brought up, and there was a discussion. The Office of Tribal Relations had assured that the AMS was of the position as well that tribes are independent of states in terms of doing this, and so a tribal producer within Indian country would not need to be authorized by state law to grow hemp in accordance with the Farm Bill, because that's a virtue of tribal sovereignty. And so it's vital that that message continues to get communicated to USDA so that that position is maintained within the agency as well. And with that, I think, in addition, we actually developed a resource for tribal looking at the tribal legal landscape for industrial hemp production in Indian country. And it kind of goes through a lot more of these legal background on all of this. It talks about the hemp market, kind of what the buzz is behind why everyone's interested in it, kind of the legal background in terms of the Farm Bill. It goes through the provisions and kind of provides some context, gives regulatory updates, and kind of goes into some concerns that tribes and tribal producers may have going forward with hemp production. And it's available for download here at this link.
Great, thank you very much, Blake. I know we've gotten several questions on hemp as well as some of the other parts of the Farm Bill. So that's a resource that's definitely available. And just to make clear, we will be sending out the slides from this webinar and at the end. So if you are taking notes very furiously, I mean, please keep doing so, but just know that they will be sending out this information and providing some additional resources, as we are about 2 weeks away from the in-person tribal consultation as well too. If you do have some additional things that you're looking at, or that some of the things that you would like to have addressed in the consultation or additional points, please also feel free to send those to us as well too. We can include those in some of the additional talking points and information as well. With that, going on to the next provision we wanted to highlight, this is going to sound probably familiar to many of you on the call. This is a new tribal advisory committee at USDA. This is to directly advise the Secretary of Agriculture on issues of agriculture throughout Indian country. This is structured and looks exactly like the Treasury Tribal Advisory Committee, or TTAC, that was established in the GWE several years ago, or the General Welfare Exclusion Act several years ago. And so it's an 11-member committee that has to be coordinated through the Office of Tribal Relations at USDA, which is, as a lot of the folks know on there, is one of the larger entities involved for tribal consultation that works with agencies throughout USDA to ensure that that there's good, strong connections to tribes and tribal producers as well. So that it will directly advise the Secretary. And so there's 3 members that the Secretary themselves will appoint, 2 members appointed by the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, and both the chair and vice chair get an appointment. 2 members appointed by the Senate Committee on Agriculture, and both the chair and ranking member get an appointment each. And then 4 members appointed by House Agriculture Committee, and that's split between both the chair and ranking. So hopefully what this will do will be something that'll be a very strong way of, in a bipartisan manner, to hopefully just have appointments to this Tribal Advisory Committee as well. So for implementation, some of the key things to be able to highlight in this, the Secretary is really required to accept nominations to the TTAC submitted by a tribe, organization, or a national regional organization. This is, sorry, a little bit more of the background for it. So the members can be appointed to serve for up to 3 years. So when you're looking at trying to be able to submit membership, it's a 3-year period, and there's you can be reappointed up to 3 consecutive terms as well. So that would be 9 years. So not only does USDA's Office of Tribal Relations involved in this process and works and sets it up with the Secretary, but there's also the requirement that the Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs or a designee attends each meeting. And hopefully this will be something that will foster some strong additional collaboration between USDA and BIA and DOI, particularly when we're looking at some of the issues of tribal agriculture on trust lands, and ensuring that there's an open line of communication between that, but then also having both USDA and the Department of Interior hearing some of the concerns regarding agriculture issues. So to now go to the implementation talking points, USDA has to begin this process by drafting a charter to establish the committee. And the secretary really needs to work closely and solicit input from tribes, tribal organizations, and look at some of the national and regional organizations that have expertise in agriculture issues to be able to take a look at who are the best nominees that must be submitted, to ensure that there's representation on that committee of all the different issues that USDA is. USDA is a very large entity that, that covers all different components, particularly with a strong rural focus of rural development, commodities, conservation, traditional foods, crop insurance, that there is strong representation throughout all of those authorities. Additionally, it needs to be made clear that USDA must work with and reach out directly to the Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs to ensure that cross agency collaboration that is envisioned by the statute is maintained and is a very beginning part of that process as well. Additionally, there are several provisions for tribal colleges and universities, and also for Native students in the research title. And USDA does a lot of work within the research title, provides money to land grant institutions, which include the 1994 tribal land grant colleges and universities, as well as some of the state land grant institutions. So there are a lot of different funding authorities that exist. We wanted to highlight a couple of those programs, some of the different changes that were made in the 2018 Farm Bill. Particularly, tribal colleges and universities are eligible entities for capacity building programs to facilitate collaboration and international partnership for teaching institutions to build capacity, research, extension programs. And also, tribal colleges and universities are now eligible for the Children, Youth, and Families at Risk program, as well as the federally recognized Tribes Extension Program, or FERTEP, which is a program that has existed since about 1990. Currently, one of the components of FERTEP existed prior to the creation of the tribal colleges and universities land grants in 1994, and has been funded at $3 million since it was created. And I think it's been funded since 1992, since it was created. Currently, right now, there's 36 FERTEP agents around the country that serve tribal communities. And these programs, one of the concerns for this is that we want to ensure that these 36 programs are maintained, and that the additional FERTEP programs that the tribal colleges and universities are now eligible for help increase that baseline number and also increase the funding for the program. Because now having additional eligibility for the program will do so much to be able to help improve the services for it. But with that must come additional money to ensure that having the additional entities ensures that there's additional service. Also, with having some of the tribal colleges and universities that have that solid, proven track record of service to their communities must have preference in those programs so that those well-established programs continue on. And then looking at trying for USDA to request within their budget some additional appropriations for these new FERTEP programs to expand out that outreach and provide those opportunities for tribal colleges and universities. When USDA makes these determinations about the FERTEP programs that they're going to fund and establish, there should be there should be 5 individuals that have that firsthand historical knowledge of the successful FERTEP programs on that review panel for the next round to help improve and support the existing FERTEP programs, but also looking at ways to be able to help establish some of the newer FERTEP programs as well too, when those applications come out. Additional talking points that tribes must consult with, or that the USDA must consult with tribes and work with tribal colleges and universities to look at some of the best ways to facilitate and support that TCU collaboration and research programs, as well as looking at ways to be able to help build some further capacity and looking at ways to be able to support some of the international partnerships. The last point, we talked a little bit about some of the funding of the program. One of the things that USDA must do, and I think this is something that's a good point to be able to insert for the consultation, is to have that USDA in its request to the president, and have this included in the president's budget request, to include at least an additional $7 million to $10 million or even more for the FERTEP program, as a true recognition that now, with tribal colleges and universities being eligible for this program, this is the exact moment that the funding for the program must go beyond its 1990 baseline level to establish more FERTEP agents and FERTEP services and programs, without there being any dip to any of the existing programs as well too. So the next part of tribal, looking at some of the tribal research provisions, is it's a new program called the New Beginning Initiative, or Rotini Initiative. And this establishes a competitive grant program for land-grant colleges and universities to provide tribal student scholarships. This is for land-grant institutions, and they must match the funds that they receive at 100%. The funds are limited at $500,000 per state. And the entire program is capped at $5 million overall. And some of the talking points for this is working directly with tribes to be able to ensure that their Native students that are going to be served by this program are looking at some of the eligibility requirements for it, and there aren't any additional barriers to that. And also talking with tribal land grants and universities to determine when the regulations come out, what are some of the specific qualifications that will reach that 100% match? And will that be something that will include reduced tuition for tribal students, which a lot of universities have, on-campus Native student centers, tuition assistance, do they do special mentoring, advising, and other programs for Native students? Are there co-curricular activities, etc.? So when USDA is looking at establishing these regulations, this is an important thing to be able to consider to ensure that tribal colleges, that the land grant institutions and also Native students will have strong access to these programs. Additionally, with the implementation of this, USDA must put in its budget request an appropriation for $5 million, and that's the max that can be funded. So that'll ensure that money flows to that program. So if we're looking at having this program funded at $5 million, including the matches that must come from the land grant institution, that's almost about $10 million worth of funding that will be supportive of providing additional opportunities and scholarships for Native students in land grant institutions. And now I'll turn it over to Blake to talk about the crop insurance provision. Blake?
Thank you, Colby. So in the crop insurance title, we see in section 11108, where it talks about underserved producers, individual tribal producers are included within the definition of underserved producers, so that it can be examined as to whether or not the crop insurance program as it is currently set up is providing adequate coverage to these individual producers. And within the Farm Bill, this section requires a report to Congress not less than once every 3 years, detailing recommendations to increase the participation in federal crop insurance programs for tribal producers and others falling within the definition of an underserved producer. And so beyond that, getting into the talking points, just this one section dealing with it, the USDA has begun the process of looking at this, but it needs to be that the USDA incorporate more tribal outreach and inclusion for producers, so this can be immediately included within the next report. And prior to the report, make sure that the USDA Risk Management Agency, which is the agency that administers the federal crop insurance program, consult with tribes and other appropriate stakeholders to determine what barriers exist so that tribes can adequately participate in this program, and get recommendations for eliminating those barriers, or so that they can be included in the next congressional report that's delivered to the House Committee on Agriculture and the Senate Committee on Agriculture.
Great. Thank you very much, Blake. Next, one of the other provisions is the tribal promise zones provision. And so tribal promise zones have existed since the previous administration. There's 4. What this language does, it ensures that the current designated tribal promise zones will continue. They're now codified in the law. There's also the ability to help improve access to resources and technical assistance to the federal agencies and partners. What promise zones really kind of do and are structured or looking at ways to try to leverage either interagency or intra-agency work and support to help build economic development, help further job growth and job support, provide educational opportunities, build not only those really good partnerships between tribal governments and the federal government, but also looking at ways to try to leverage partnerships and infuse private partnerships into those as well too, that can help support the growth of tribal economies. These are very important because they rely on those types of collaborative relationships, and the promise zones do look at trying to optimize a lot of those. So looking at the talking points for that, it is required underneath the law that within 1 year of the enactment of the Farm Bill, which just the flag for everybody, that is this upcoming December, right before Christmas. So Congress did this to USDA. That the secretary must report, must consult with tribes to determine what the minimum number of nominated zones that should be designated as tribal promise zones are. This is important because with those 4, there is the ability underneath this provision to expand that out, and so the USDA must now take a look at that. Additionally, if USDA wants to do that, these now must be designated as tribal promise zones by January 2020. So USDA does have to, if they're going to nominate additional zones, they must start that process now. So because of this and because there's that setup, USDA and the agencies and the interagencies must work directly with tribes to set up some of the additional selection criteria and provide some additional minimum poverty and unemployment standards for determining which nominated zones should be designated as tribal promise zones. And these are things that are all required underneath the tribal promise zones provision. One of the last things that we wanted to flag within this is the provisions that are in the rural development title of the Farm Bill. A lot of folks are familiar with on this call rural development. The rural development title and rural development programs at USDA can provide a lot of additional loan and grant resources for tribal governments, tribal entities that build out large-scale infrastructure, small-scale infrastructure, community facilities, broadband, water, telecommunications, roads, housing. There's always that old adage that USDA used to say you could be able to build an entirety of a rural town from the ground up using USDA authorities. So some of the different tweaks that were included that are tribal specific in rural development is that there's an establishment of a permanent tribal technical assistance and service office, which is something that's supposed to sit and provide technical assistance directly to tribal entities that are applying for rural development programs. And that exists across all of rural development's funding authorities. There's also, for substantially underserved trust area designated programs, substantially underserved trust areas or SUDA programs, those exist in 5 different areas, and what those do is those provide a tribal priority for the underserved trust areas to have access to them, also waive some of the matching requirements as well, and as a way to be able to help build out and support tribal entities applying for those programs. While this is something that was sought to be expanded over the entirety of rural development and not just over 5 of the funding authorities, what was changed in this is the ability for rural development to actually refinance a lot of these loans. This is an important change because even though rural development was a large scale, essentially a banker lending out money, it, unlike almost any other lending institution, did not have the statutory authority to engage in refinancing. And so when you're paying out a large scale loan over 20, 30, or 40 years, economic realities change on the ground and nationally and globally. Other things come and impact their abilities to be able to structure repayments and to make repayments. And so when those issues came up, USDA for for anybody, didn't have the authority to be able to make any types of changes to a repayment plan. And so there would be defaults on loans just simply because of those changes and simply because USDA could not do that. And when you default on a federal loan, particularly a loan at USDA, it makes it nearly impossible, if not completely impossible, to be able to have access to any other federal loans. So this is a very important authority that does allow USDA to be able to take a look at those realities, and then also work with the folks that it is lending to ensure that the programs are repaying and that they are working directly with them to address some of their concerns and the realities that are occurring. Additionally, there's 2 broadband programs in the Farm Bill that have tribal priority and inclusion, and also have bolstered money as well too. So there's the Rural Connect program, and then there's eConnect. Both those programs are funded at $25 million overall. Now total, that funding's been bumped up to $300 million. So there's a strong amount of money in here for broadband programs. And again, those programs do have additional tribal inclusion and also tribal priority for them. So looking at some of the implementation talking points, one of the components in here, and this is something that is, we've heard this webinar, again, we're on the last slide, it makes sense to kind of address this. There's a lot of different components talking about additional consultation, and I think that's important because one of the things that is important is that when, while there may be 1 or 2 or hopefully 3 in-person tribal consultations from USDA, these should not be the one-time and be-all access points to talking to USDA regarding how these programs are implemented. So essentially what this does is it's a strong request that rural development itself as an agency conducts specific tribal consultations regarding the implementation, not only of all the rural development programs of importance, but particularly looking at the Technical Assistance Office and broadband programs. And this will hopefully facilitate those type of direct conversations with rural development's consulting officials and decision makers to be able to ensure the adequate implementation of those programs. Additionally, USDA must take steps to consult with tribes on the Technical Assistance Office as soon as possible, and to ensure that that tribes that are looking to apply for rural development programs, that they have that type of technical assistance available to them, and the next rounds of funding that become available underneath rural development's programs. Additionally, looking at the implementation of the broadband provisions, it must ensure that the applications that have priority points for tribes and tribal entities are applied correctly. And one of the things that we have seen is that when some of the application components for points that do not specifically fit a tribal entity's application, just because tribal entities may not qualify for that area and can't receive points, and those are the point totals, they add up to see who ends up actually getting the grant or loan, that the inability to be able to fit a particular part of it should not count against tribal entities, or potentially looking at ways to have some of the tribal specific components of it actually count for more points to ensure that there is some type of equity and balance within those authorities. So with that, we've gotten several questions and comments from folks, and we'll go through some answering those now. If you haven't submitted your comment yet and you'd like to, you can do so by typing it into the question box on the right-hand side of the screen. If you'd like to ask it aloud, you certainly can. You can also hit the hand raise button, and I can unmute your microphone, and we can answer your question as well too. And also, please feel free if you have comments to be able to, and the things you'd like to be able to see that are included in here as well, please let us know. Again, there are 63 provisions overall in the bill. Some of them we view quite as we're kind of terming almost marginally self-implementing, but we wanted to highlight some of the larger ones that needed some additional discussion, but there certainly are others that can and do need to be discussed in consultation, so please feel free to raise any additional thoughts on those as well too. So the first question we have is about, does any tribe have a current testing facility or processing plant for hemp production? Blake, I don't know if you want to take a stab at answering that question.
I can. To my knowledge, I don't know of any, because in order to have had the ability to have a testing facility set up, that would have given that they had participated in the hemp production program under the 2014 Farm Bill. And I don't know of any tribes that have taken advantage of that because of the roadblocks that are there in terms of having to go through the state, and sometimes those partnerships are not there. As far as processing, the same in that vein, I don't know of any at this particular time.
Okay, great, thanks. And again, as this is a newer authority, this is something that is I think it's a good question to be able to ask and start to look at if tribes are interested in that type of production. The next question we have is on the FDIPR 638 program. So the question is the appropriation for $5 million, is that $5 million overall, or is it $5 million per tribe? Aaron, would you like to answer that question?
Sure, I can answer that. So that is a $5 million overall. It wouldn't be $5 million per tribe. The only reason it would be per tribe is if the money is appropriated and only one tribe was able to get a contract. So that's why one of those talking points that we went over was encouraging USDA to take that $5 million overall and do demonstration projects with multiple tribes. But it is a $5 million overall provision. So thank you for asking that. It's a good question.
Great, thank you. And additionally, there's a question asked about being able to get access to the monthly tribal leaders consultations that USDA is doing. Is there ability to be able to access those calls? Are they holding out those calls widely? And I guess how would one seek information about that?
Yeah, so USDA sends around call-in information usually the week before each call, and they send those out through the regional FNS offices to all of the FDIPR sites. So if there are tribal leaders out there or FDIPR site employees who want to be on those phone calls, that's where the information comes through. You can also definitely reach out to me about that. I think we have our contact information on a slide somewhere, but my email address is eshirl@uark.edu, ESHIRL@uark.edu, and you can email me about that as well. Like I said, the calls usually happen the first Thursday of every month at 1 p.m. Eastern. It won't happen the first Thursday of next month, though, because that will be one of the days of this consultation actually in DC. So I think we're going to reschedule for the following Thursday. So this next one will be the second Thursday in May. But we are still planning to keep going with those every month with USDA. So please reach out to me if you have any questions about those.
Great, thank you, Aaron. The next question we have is about the alternative funding arrangement. The alternative funding arrangement allows for USDA to enter into an agreement to help fund tribal conservation practices. And so this would be looking at a different way of structuring it than USDA structures direct payments to tribal producers underneath that program. So underneath alternative funding arrangements, a tribe would be the producer underneath that. And so they would actually end up not only just getting money for the conservation practice, but they would almost step into the same place as NRCS or USDA would within the administration of that program. So they would actually be in charge of implementing the practice, managing the money for it, doing the reporting that's required underneath it, and also all of the accounting and other components that go along with that. So it's a pretty robust program, but it is a way to be able to have a conservation program that is not only accessing that USDA dollars for it, but is structured in a way that helps support tribal conservation practices and also tribal management of those conservation practices as well too. The next question we have on FERTEP and what it includes. FERTEP, as the federally recognized tribes extension program, provides educational resources and output to tribal producers in various different areas. So it has a pretty large focus. It doesn't just include some very small different areas. So it's looking at some of the different components that it can cover, and it usually is pretty unique and specific to the different tribal areas and entities and producers that it serves within those different areas. One thing I will include, because there's a question asked about forestry in here, is that one of the equity components of within the research title is actually equity and parity for tribal colleges and universities to access what's called McIntyre-Stennis Act funding, and that funds forestry programs at four-year institutions. So now tribal colleges and universities that are four-year institutions have access to that pot of money to help train the next generation of native foresters. So that's an additional provision as well. Next question we asked is there more information on the youth programs and also the emergency and transitional shelter for domestic violence victims? There isn't any additional information on that as well too. We can definitely take a look at that and see what USDA is looking to be able to do. I think those are important points to consider within that, because there are additional tribal inclusions in both of those in that program, particularly for folks seeking emergency and transitional shelter for domestic violence. So we can take a look at that and try to be able to provide some additional information on that. But I think that is a good point to raise if you're submitting comments and or going to be at the consultation in person, to ensure that when those programs and those new authorities are being implemented by USDA, that they're doing so and including and ensuring that tribal governments and Native women have access to those same services that are provided underneath them. The next comment we got is actually a good comment. This is why you always ask questions if you have one on a webinar, from Catherine Minthorn. The answer that Burns Paiute tribe has actually announced that they'll be opening a hemp processing plant in the future. So it is something that is being considered by several tribes, and it looks like one is taking a step forward and looking at operating a processing facility. So that might be a good connection for some tribal governments and tribal producers that are looking into hemp production right now and looking for a facility to be able to do processing. The next question we got is about the Tribal Advisory Committee. There isn't a deadline for a submission of names for the Tribal Advisory Committee yet. USDA has to set up the entirety of that advisory committee, so it has to develop out a charter, and then it has to appoint people to it, and so there'll be a process as part of that charter that is announced as far as accepting nominations for it. USDA will have to select folks for it, and they'll have to have a criteria that goes along with that as well. And then there'll be congressional appointments. Folks that are familiar with how the Treasury Tribal Advisory Committee went know that sometimes Congress, to be putting it nicely, can be a little slow in how it appoints people to some of these committees. So, one of the things that needs to be looked at is when USDA gets this established, who is in leadership on both as both chair and ranking members in the committees that make those appointments, to work with folks to have them recommend who those folks are, because they get appointments for those as well too. And with this tribal advisory board, this is something that is that covers all of USDA's authorities. So this isn't just focused on conservation or food nutrition or hemp or any of the other programmatic authorities at USDA for forestry. This is something that sits over the entirety of USDA. So having a lot of broad representation from different agriculture segments within Indian country is important as well to have on that. So I think that's something that can be considered. So one of the questions we got about is looking at some of the technical assistance programs that have a lack of funding. The lack of funding for some of these provisions is important because, with authorities, it doesn't guarantee that those are going to be set up. So those are always things that can be requested that USDA not only includes within its budget authority to be able to, or within its budget request to the president to ask for money for those, but also USDA can fund those authorities under some of its other funding structures. So that can be something that USDA takes and considers as well too. They don't have to ask for new money for those programs, but it makes that a little bit harder, but that's something that the agency can consider as well too. For example, for the Tribal Technical Assistance program at Rural Development can set up that program. They don't need additional money from Congress to do that, like the 638 FDIPA provision requires a specific appropriation. So our Rural Development can start and develop that process instantly. But one of the things that they can't do is, one of the things that they can't do is essentially, they have to put money probably within the same programmatic pot that they have. So those are important points to be able to make, I think, during the consultation. One of the questions we got is there small business education included within the context of, or small business education focused on Indigenous communities with economic development in the current version of the Farm Bill? It's a very good question. There are some newer beginning farmer and rancher programs, as well as socially disadvantaged farmer and rancher programs, and tribal producers are included underneath the definition of socially disadvantaged. Those programs help support those newer farmers to help build out their farm businesses. Those programs were combined in this Farm Bill, and it actually has stronger inclusion and parity for tribal producers. And it also has reporting requirements. So it has to. So when those programs come out, USDA actually has to do a report on how those programs are working for all the different entities that's supposed to be serving. So one of the things is that we'll know if these programs are working for tribal producers or not, and then can try to be able to address some of that. That program actually has $50 million worth of, I wish it was $50 million. It was supposed to be $50 million, but it was $30 million that what they finally decided on for that program as baseline funding. So it establishes that program that has money that ensures that you don't have to go back to Congress every appropriation cycle, and it is actually built into that $428 billion number that the Farm Bill has overall. Additionally, there's also the Local Access Marketing Program, which now includes support for, or now as inclusion for tribal producers in that. That helps tribal producers get into some of those market programs, so be able to help support their marketing and building up their businesses and being able to help sell in those as well too. So that's another program that has some of that additional inclusion. One of the questions we got is about SNAP-Ed from Sarah Miracle. So the question is, do you anticipate SNAP-Ed and nutrition education being addressed? Those things weren't included in some of the components of the Farm Bill. That might be something that Congress might take up off cycle. We don't know. It most likely wouldn't be included in what we think Congress is going to do next around some of the USDA programs, which would be child nutrition. But we think that there could be some other opportunities for that as well too. So we are taking a look at that. There were some changes that were proposed to SNAP-Ed that would have made it more difficult than it already is for many tribal communities to have access to that funding and to be able to provide those educational services around SNAP to their program participants and to their communities. So that's something that we are taking a look at as well too. And again, if you have any additional questions, please feel free to type them into the question box. You can also raise your hand as well too. I can unmute your microphone and you can ask your questions live. We have another question about the Tribal Advisory Committee. Would that be made up of all tribal members? I would think so. I guess it would depend on what USDA does for the eligibility for that. But I think the specific language talks about folks with specific expertise within tribal agriculture as well. So hopefully that'll be an additional requirement component of the program. But I think it's something that is an important point to raise. We have a question about tribal producers. Tribal producers and producer overall can be a pretty broad term. A lot of times that producer term is defined within its particular program and function at USDA. So it can fit something that's larger. It almost depends on what that authority is meant to be able to do. So the specific question we got about fisheries management equate to tribal producer, it would depend on the program and what that type of management was looking to be able to do. As USDA just really kind of looks at some of the non-water aspects of agriculture and really in the dirt, unless it's focused on conservation. That might be, you can try to use some of the conservation programs as ways to help support fisheries management and water health overall. But USDA doesn't does a little bit with aquaculture, but not as much as Fish and Wildlife Service does or Department of Interior does. And the next question we have is about FDIPR traditional foods and regionally grown purchases. Are there any plans or options to purchase smaller quantities of these foods? And additionally, will producers of these foods need to go through the traditional USDA AMS new vendor process to sell these foods to FDIPR, or will there be a different process? Erin, do you have any thoughts on this question?
Sure, I can talk about that. So I haven't heard any particular plans to change current procurement practices, but that might be a good question to ask on those Farm Bill implementation calls that happen every month. So I would encourage you, if you can, to join the next one or to ask that at consultation if you're able to come to the consultation in December, or excuse me, in DC next month. I think that unless, yeah, I think you're probably going to still have to go through that AMS process, though. I don't think that there would be any exemption necessarily from that, because that's the way that the regs are written. Any kind of USDA food is what it's called. Anything that's purchased by the government for inclusion in any of the USDA programs pretty much has to go through that system. So you would still have to go through that vendor certification process with the Agricultural Marketing Service. One of the things that we have that has come out in consultation, though, and just for anybody who doesn't know, when there are bids out for food that goes into the FDIPR food package or any of the foods that AMS purchases for USDA foods, you don't necessarily have to bid on the whole amount to be able to get food and to get a bid accepted once you are a vendor in that system. That's part of how we got wild rice into the FDIPR food package at all. A couple of different tribal businesses actually went in and separately bid for a portion of the total poundage that USDA was looking for. So just because somebody doesn't have the ability to actually do the whole bid, that doesn't mean it's a bar to participating in that program or selling into the USDA food system. So if that's something that you're looking at maybe as another avenue or market for food products, that's still available. But I don't see an alternative to the AMS situation currently. As far as I know, I think that would probably necessitate a regulatory change.
Great. Thank you very much, Erin, and thank you for that really good question. The next question we have is asking about tribal colleges and universities being eligible for FERTIP if they're 4-year programs. I don't know if that's the possibility. Tribal colleges and universities that are 4-year programs, that's the requirement to be eligible for the forestry funding for forestry students, and that's under McIntyre Stennis, and that's a different section of it. What is a requirement for tribal colleges and universities being eligible for FERTIP is being a 1994 tribal college land grant institution. So that's I don't know if that means every single land grant institution is 4 year. 1994 is a 4-year college or not. I don't know that off the top of my head, but that's the requirement for that. So that's a good question. The next question we have is about are tribal governments involved in writing the regulations on hemp issues? And I think that's a good question. And I think we talked a little bit about some of the importance of consultation. Blake, I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about kind of the regulation process or highlight some of the points that tribes should be looking out for, particularly in the regulation writing component of this.
Oh, sure. I can actually elaborate on that a little bit in terms of tribal involvement, at least from within USDA, on the writing the regulations and in the implementation process. This question was actually raised in the April 11th listening session, and the answer from AMS was that there is not currently a tribal liaison within AMS working on this. the most involvement that they have is they meet regularly with the staff of the Office of Tribal Relations to ensure that the unique tribal needs are taken into account from the expertise on staff there and what they're receiving in terms of input from tribal leaders in the meetings that they hold, kind of liaising between tribal producers, tribal leaders, and the AMS, kind of the OTR, Office of Tribal Relations, being that bridge. So that's kind of tribal participation when directly in the process would probably come within the form of the listening sessions that have been regularly been happening, I guess, monthly now, and then kind of staying involved throughout consultations like those on the first and second. One thing to note is that the tribes that want to take on the on-reservation regulation of hemp production have to submit a plan to USDA, and there's about 7 different requirements within the Farm Bill, and kind of getting into the testing and the records maintenance and the inspections and the disposal of plants that are above the 0.3% THC, which would throw it under the legal definition of marijuana. So what happens if it's too high of THC? Those are some of the things that have to be addressed in that plan, and we can provide more information on that if needed. It's also detailed in that white paper that we talked about earlier, and has the link in the slides that'll be provided later. But within that, there's also an assurance that the tribe has the resources to devote to implementing this plan and making sure that the regulations are going to be enforced. So that might be an area where there could be some subjective interpretation that might need some clarification in the regulatory processes. What is defined as adequate resources to doing this, and also making sure that there is a process by which the approval will be guaranteed. And it's also worth mentioning as a second point to that the requirements to be included in a tribal plan to assume jurisdiction and regulatory authority over hemp production on the reservation, the requirements in there, those are just the minimum of what you need to submit within the Farm Bill. So you can make them more strict than what's in there. You could implement different provisions of tribal law in there if you want. No, it's unclear whether or not, if you want to change the tribal laws that are included in a plan, whether or not you've got to resubmit that to USDA or not. So that might be another question to ask. But those are some additional considerations in the regulatory process, and where tribes might have some input in terms of how this is going to be implemented and clarified in the future.
Great, thank you, Blake, for that. Thank you, Aaron, for your previous answers too. If folks have other questions, please feel free to type them in the question box. We're getting up to the last couple of minutes of our 90 minutes that we have scheduled for this, and we want to be respectful of folks' time, but we know there are a lot of questions. Again, we will be doing an additional webinar to discuss this as well too, and also holding out other ones throughout the implementation process to keep folks involved and to be able to try to get some additional input, and also be able to ensure that folks know what is happening at USDA as best as we can tell and what we know, and to be able to ensure that you're able to have the opportunity to be able to engage with USDA, the consulting officials, throughout the entirety of this process. And again, we will be sending out the PowerPoint from this, and also hopefully posting a recording of this webinar as well too, so that folks can have access to it later on as well, and so that hopefully we can try to be able to address some of the different concerns of folks that weren't able to join or had some difficulty trying to make connections to it, to have access to that as well. With that, the last thing we want to plug, I think, is that one potential legislative issue. We're talking a lot about some of the implementation parts, but as we're kind of talking about it here, implementation is about 51% of the Farm Bill process, so that was an incredibly important step. Additionally, though, Congress is looking at reauthorizing the child nutrition programs, and that includes the school and lunch breakfast programs, summer food service program, which has a high usage and is an important program for many tribal communities, adult and aftercare programs, the snack program, all of WIC, on the entirety of WIC Farmers Market program, and also the fruit and vegetable program and special milk program. We're going to be doing a webinar on the child nutrition reauthorization in about 2 weeks or so. We're just getting that scheduled out now to talk through some of the specifics of these programs. But these are important things to consider, both the the Senate Committee on Agriculture, which has jurisdiction on this on the Senate side, and the House Education and Workforce Committee, which has jurisdiction over child nutrition programs, not the House Agriculture Committee, but the House Ed and Workforce that has jurisdiction. Each of those have held their own hearings as well. There was previously a Tribal Nutrition Improvement Act that was put forward in 2 previous Congresses that would help tribal eligibility and also recognition of tribes authorities to be able to help run and manage many of these programs that was introduced. Hopefully this will be something that will be introduced in the 116th Congress that's being discussed right now. So that's something to be able to think about as well. Additionally, just have my contact on here, but we can connect you with all of our folks on our team, as well as the folks of the Native Farm Bill Coalition. If your tribe has not, or your tribal organization has not joined, again, please, and we encourage you to join this effort as well. You can email myself or go to the Native Farm Bill Coalition.org's website to get more information about that. And you can also contact Aaron Parker and also Blake Jackson on our team to talk about some of the specific issues that they discussed as well. And so with that, I just want to thank all of you very much for your time today on this webinar, for your really great questions and your continued engagement as the Farm Bill goes into this implementation phase. You know, again, as soon as we get more information regarding if there's any additional tribal consultations, which we hope there will at least be 1 or 2 more, we'll get those out as well too. And we'll send out all the information that we presented today and some additional stuff as well in the next coming days to all the folks that are registered for this. So again, thank you all very much. Thank you all very much to Aaron and Blake on our team for being here presenting. And also want to say thank you very much to the Shakopee, Metawakan, and Sioux community for their continued support and leadership of the Native Farm Bill Coalition as well too. A lot of this work would not be possible without their vision and guidance and support and putting forth the Native Farm Bill Coalition efforts. And thank you to all of you that have joined and done this. There wouldn't be 63 provisions to talk about on a long webinar like this without all of the tribal governments and tribal organizations that joined together as well too. So thank you all very much for joining us, and we look forward to talking with you all on a future webinar.